So, with President Trump's recent activation of the California National Guard against the wishes of the California governor, it's created a lot of confusion about how does the Guard work, how does active duty work, what are the rules, and everything else. And let me just say this before I get into it. I served 22 years in the Air National Guard, and it was probably about year 10 when I finally really understood all this. So, if you're confused at the end of this, don't worry about it. That's pretty normal. But let me just get to the bottom line. First off, active duty troops come under what's called Title 10. So, for this purpose, just remember that Title 10 is active duty and it's under the authority of the president. Now, active duty troops are restricted from law enforcement because of posse comitatus. And so they cannot do law enforcement. They can do things like protect federal buildings. They can even protect borders within a few miles. There's some rules there. But that's in essence all that federal troops can do, unless the Insurrection Act is invoked, which gives the president then, based on insurrection, based on invasion, or, stuff like that, then the president can use active duty troops for law enforcement. That should be very rare. The last time it was invoked was 1992 in LA for the LA riots at the request of the California governor, by the way. So that's active duty. Under active duty, we're going to talk about the Army and the Air Force because that's where you have National Guard as well. Under the Army, you have the Army Reserve and you have the Army National Guard. Air Force is Air Force Reserve and Air National Guard. So the reserve forces are just that. They're reserves for the active duty. So they also come under what's called Title 10, which means they're under presidential authority at all times and they cannot do law enforcement. The National Guard is different. The National Guard is also a reserve component of the active duty. And so, in addition to serving as a reserve component of active duty, so each officer, for instance, in the National Guard is commissioned as a Title 10, so an active duty officer, but they also have a mission to the state. That we'll call Title 32, but it's basically the governor has the ability and has control of the National Guard under certain circumstances. So this is where it gets confusing. If the governor of California activates his National Guard under his authority, then that guard, because of militia and posse comitatus, can do law enforcement. So that's when you see things like when a governor calls up their guard for riots or for sandbagging in a flood, things like that. They come under the authority of the governor and have a completely different mission. But if the president calls them up against the consent of the governor, okay, that's the key. And that hasn't happened since 1965 until this recent activation. If the president calls them up against the consent of the governor, they are called up under Title 10. So the Army National Guard, the Air National Guard would be Title 10 forces. They are no different than active duty at that point. So when President Trump calls up 4,000 California Guardsmen under Title 10 without the consent of the governor, they are, for all intents and purposes, United States Army. They're no different than like the 82nd Airborne with the same restrictions without the governor's consent. So that's a big thing to keep in mind. Now, if a president decides to call them up and the governor agrees to do it, they can put them under different authorities and give them the ability to do law enforcement. This is really the key. Even though they have California National Guard shields and everything else, until the Insurrection Act is invoked, in which case all troops under Title 10 have the authority to do law enforcement for that limited period of time and that limited mission. Unless that is invoked, these guys and men and women of the California National Guard are no different than U.S. Army troops. So that's the big thing to keep in mind. So it looks like a lot of this was for show, and that's exactly the case. The states, by the Second Amendment, are guaranteed, as well as your right to keep and bear arms, a well-regulated militia is protected under the Second Amendment. That has always been considered to be the National Guard. But in a case like this, when the president can override the authority of a governor on the National Guard, is that really a militia? I'd be interested in your question on the comments there, what we could do about it. But hopefully this clears up a little bit of the confusion. A president can only activate the National Guard with the consent of the governor. If he does it without, they are under Title 10 federal authority, same rules and requirements as the U.S. Army.